December 19th, 1930. A freezing Friday on the Maggodee Creek Bridge in Franklin County, Virginia. Two brothers sit at the wheels of two cars. Both are heavy, with the weight of illicit moonshine. In one sits Forrest Bondurant. He's 29 years old, drawn as tight and hard as a blacksmith's anvil. He's a man, the county already whispers, is immune to death. In the other car is his little brother, Jack. He's 20 years old, trembling with a volatile cocktail of terror and fierce pride. From the winter brush, two figures step onto the road, deputies Charlie Rakes and Henry Absher. The badges on their chests catch the pale light. The pistols in their hands are already drawn. They demand the brothers surrender the load. Forrest stares them down. He coldly reminds the deputies that their protection money has already been paid. But the lawmen just don't care. Desperate to protect the shipment, Jack yanks the keys from his ignition. He hurls them down the steep bank toward the creek. Charlie Rakes opens fire. The first bullet tears directly through Jack. It rips in under one arm and exits through the other side of his body. Forrest lunges toward his bleeding brother. Rakes shoots him, too square in the stomach. By the time the oldest brother, Howard, arrives at the bridge, Forrest and Jack are bleeding out. They're lying on the wooden boards in the biting December cold. The deputies simply commandeer the liquor. They drive away into the hollows, leaving them for dead. But they don't die. By sundown, both Bondurant boys are lying in a Roanoke hospital. The local newspapers blast the story. A county supervisor's two sons, gunned down by officers. And they're telling a population that already knows exactly who they are. The Bondurant boys, notorious, dangerous, the brothers who refused to be put in the ground. These weren't just three backwoods outlaws running corn liquor out of the hollows. Forrest, Howard, and Jack Bondurant were among the most feared moonshiners in the wettest county in America. This was a county where, according to the estimate of one federal official, all but one of its 30,000 residents had a hand in the illegal whiskey trade. A county where the sheriff was comfortably on the payroll. A county where the Commonwealth's attorney himself, a grandnephew of Confederate General Robert E. Lee, would eventually stand trial. He'd be tried for orchestrating the largest bootlegging conspiracy in the history of Prohibition. The Bondurants didn't merely survive this world. They fought it. They bled in it. They became an absolute myth. This is the true story of three brothers from Franklin County, Virginia. Men who transformed a backwoods family trade into a foundational pillar of a $5.5 million criminal empire. Men who refused to bow to a crooked badge and who walked out of every grave the world tried to dig for them. This is the real history behind the Hollywood film Lawless. This is the raw truth the movie glossed over. The Bondurants weren't outlaws driven by ambition. They were outlaws by inheritance. Their story isn't a tidy, glamorous, cinematic crime thriller. It was a brutal, grinding war. A war waged between a handful of Appalachian mountain families and the United States government. And nearly everyone breathing in Franklin County was standing on the wrong side of the law. To understand the Bondurants, you have to understand the dirt of Franklin County, tucked deep into the rugged foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, roughly 30 miles south of Roanoke. It was a punishing, impoverished landscape. Red clay, steep, unforgiving hollows, and corn struggling to grow on land too rocky to sustain anything else. By the time Prohibition slammed into law in 1920, the people of Franklin County had already been distilling their own whiskey for well over a century. To them, it was never a crime. It was simple arithmetic. A bushel of corn sold at market for next to nothing. But that same bushel, run through the coils of a copper still, yielded gallons of liquor worth a small fortune on the streets. In a county where families were literally starving, that kind of math wasn't a temptation. It was basic survival. The Bondurant bloodline ran deep in that red clay, rooted in Franklin County since the 1700s. The boy's father, Greenville Thomas Bondurant, was a respected farmer. He served on the county board of supervisors. Their mother was Melissa Barbour. It was a good, sturdy family until catastrophe struck. In 1918, the devastating Spanish flu pandemic ripped through the mountains. It took the life of their mother, Melissa, and killed two of their sisters. Forrest himself contracted the brutal fever. He hovered on the edge of death, but he miraculously survived. Howard would later confide that this was the very moment he first believed his brothers couldn't be killed. Howard was the eldest of the boys, born in the 1890s. Then came Forrest, born on October 21st, 1901. And finally, Jack, the baby of the family, born April 8th, 1910. When Howard returned from the battlefields of the First World War, he came back fundamentally broken. He was a survivor who couldn't sleep unless a bottle was within arm's reach. A man who drank relentlessly until his nightmares were submerged. By the time the 18th Amendment passed in 1920, establishing Prohibition, Howard was already a man burdened with far too much pain and entirely too little work. Moonshine was the immediate, obvious answer. He needed it to drink, and he needed it to sell. Forrest was the middle child, but he was the undeniable brain of the entire operation. He was unnervingly quiet and deeply watchful. He was the kind of man who might speak 3 words in an entire day, but who meant every single syllable. By his late 20s, Forrest was running the Blackwater filling station. It was a vital crossroads, a combination gas pump, restaurant, and covert moonshine way station. It was perched on the road between the remote hollows and Rocky Mount. The liquor flowed down from the hidden stills in the woods. The buyers' cars drove up from Roanoke, from Lynchburg, and from as far away as Washington and Baltimore. Forrest sat calmly at the counter. He took the money, he set the prices, and his cold eyes watched absolutely everything. And then there was Jack. Vain, ambitious. A kid who desperately wanted to be somebody. Jack wanted a Ford with white wall tires. He wanted a sharply tailored suit. He craved the intoxicating feeling of walking into a crowded room, watching the men nod in respect and the women look twice. Jack was the dreamer. And in the treacherous landscape of Franklin County in 1930, that made him the most dangerous Bondurant of them all. Because dreamers are willing to take the fatal risks that careful men will not. By the late 1920s, the 3 brothers had built a formidable enterprise. It wasn't the largest operation in the county, but it commanded immense respect. They operated a copper pot still, meticulously hidden in the dense woods above their family land. Forrest negotiated the deals. Howard provided the heavy lifting and the terrifying muscle. Jack ran the fast deliveries. They sold their product to a sprawling network of bootleggers. These men smuggled the liquor north in heavily modified Ford coupes, cars with bored-out engines, reinforced suspensions, and hidden floor compartments. For the most part, the Bondurants kept their own hands clean of the actual transport. They made the product. They took the cash. For a few years, in a county where unchecked greed was getting men slaughtered, their quiet discipline kept them breathing. But the deadly reality of Franklin County was rapidly closing in. You couldn't stay small forever. By the late 1920s, the moonshine business in Franklin County had been meticulously, brutally organized from the top down. And the man sitting at the very pinnacle of this empire wasn't a moonshiner at all. He was the law. His name was Charles Carter Lee. He was the Commonwealth's attorney of Franklin County and the grandnephew of Confederate General Robert E. Lee, educated, polished, and impeccably dressed. He was the kind of man who would shake hands at Sunday church and quote scripture at the courthouse on Monday. But according to federal prosecutors, Carter Lee was the chief instigator of what would become known as the Great Moonshine Conspiracy. Running from 1928 to 1935, this massive criminal syndicate defrauded the United States government out of $5.5 million in unpaid whiskey excise taxes. Adjusted for today, that's roughly $120 million, bleeding out of one single mountain county in just 7 years. Here's exactly how the machine worked. The local sheriff, D. Wilson Hodes, known around the county simply as Pete, had spent $2,000 of his own money to win his office, and he set out with ruthless efficiency to make it all back. Pete and his deputies approached the local moonshiners with a non-negotiable deal. Pay a fee, and the deputies wouldn't smash your still. Pay the fee, and your liquor moved down the mountain without a shadow of trouble. The price was fixed. $25 for every operating still, and $10 for every load of whiskey that rolled out of the county. They called it the granny fee. Within a year, every major moonshiner in Franklin County was paying it, and the money was staggering. While a sheriff drew a legal salary of about $100 a month, and deputies drew no base salary whatsoever, the protection take could run a deputy $200 a month or more. This was how men living on a rural lawman's pay ended up driving brand new cars. One specific deputy, Jeff Richards, became the conspiracy's designated collector, the bagman who moved the dirty money around. But the conspiracy didn't just protect the moonshiners, it actively supplied them. Operating through mercantile fronts around places like Ferrum, the network moved jaw-dropping quantities of raw materials. When the famed novelist Sherwood Anderson traveled down to cover the ensuing case for Liberty magazine, he laid the sheer math of the operation bare. The syndicate had moved nearly 34 million pounds of sugar, more than 15 million pounds of corn and rye meal, 15 million pounds of miscellaneous grain, over 1 million pounds of malt, and literally tons of hops and yeast. It was enough raw material, Anderson reckoned, to account for some 3.5 million gallons of moonshine, all pouring out of one single mountain county. His coverage cemented the name the region carries to this day, the wettest county in the world. The Bondurants paid the granny fee for a while. They had no choice. But by 1930, something in the air had shifted. The brothers had started pushing back. They stopped paying the full tax. Forrest had tense words with deputies in his roadhouse. Word reached the crooked lawmen that the Bondurant boys thought they were above the system. Word quickly came back down the mountain that the Bondurants needed a violent lesson. Which brings us right back to the blood on the Maggodee Creek Bridge. The shooting on December 19, 1930, wasn't a random traffic stop. It was a calculated message. 2 deputies, 2 brothers, 2 cars full of liquor, and a steadfast refusal to surrender. Jack took a bullet completely through his body. Forrest took 1 square in the stomach while rushing to his brother's aid. The deputies left them bleeding on the cold wood and stole the load, a load which almost certainly got resold through the very same criminal network they were supposed to be policing. Henry Absher, one of the 2 deputies on the bridge that day, would later be directly tied in court to the illegal resale of seized liquor and equipment. Both Bondurant brothers survived. Of course they did. They were Bondurants. The newspapers ran the story, the county read the headlines, and everyone understood exactly what it meant. The Bondurants had been marked for death, and the Bondurants weren't the kind of men to forget. But the war didn't end on the bridge, because what happened to Forrest next is the story Franklin County still tells in hushed whispers. Sometime during this escalating stretch of violence, Forrest was working late at the Blackwater filling station. 2 men walked through the doors. Historical accounts vary on exactly who they were and what they demanded, but the grisly result is permanently documented in the family record. The men overpowered him, they took a blade, and they cut Forrest Bondurant's throat. Leaving him for dead in a pool of his own blood on the floor of his roadhouse, the men walked out into the freezing night. They fully expected that he would never draw another breath. What Forrest did next became the ultimate Franklin County legend. He stood up, he clamped his hands over his severed neck, holding his own flesh together. By the family's telling, he walked 9 miles through the heavy snow to the hospital and lived. The doctors frantically stitched him back together. The unvarnished truth is likely a bit less cinematic. The hospital was probably closer, and he was almost certainly driven part of the way. But here is what is historically documented, and what his great-nephew Matt Bondurant later confirmed. Forrest's throat was slashed wide open, and Forrest survived. Every man in Franklin County who once believed the Bondurants could be broken now understood with terrifying clarity that they couldn't. They began calling Forrest the Rasputin of the hollers, the man who simply couldn't be killed. Then came Howard, the wild one, the heavy drinker, the combat veteran with the 1,000-yard stare. When Howard heard what had been done to Forrest, the story goes that he went on a rampage that lasted for weeks. He drank furiously. He fought. He hunted men through the winding county roads with heavy brass knuckles in his pocket and a loaded pistol tucked into his belt. And the deep local lore says, though it lives far more in family memory than in any official court record, that Howard eventually tracked down at least one of the men involved in the brutal attack on his brother. Exactly what Howard did to that man, the family absolutely refuses to say. But after one particular night, that man's name vanished from Franklin County entirely, and he never came back. The Bondurants had survived, but the brutal war they were caught up in was rapidly becoming bigger than 3 brothers. The United States government was already moving against the entire county, and it all started with the staggering numbers. Federal Prohibition officials had begun stating openly that out of Franklin County's 30,000 residents, all but a literal handful were deeply entangled in the illicit whiskey trade. 99 out of 100. That kind of bold statistic in a federal file was a blinding signal that Washington had finally noticed. The Treasury Department's alcohol tax unit decided it was time to bring the hammer down. They sent in their absolute best man, Colonel Thomas Bailey, a highly decorated First World War veteran turned federal agent. Bailey was tough, infinitely patient, and smart enough to do what no lawman had ever accomplished in Franklin County before. He didn't kick down doors or try to arrest the moonshiners in the woods. Instead, he posed quietly as a small-time buyer. For roughly 2 agonizingly slow years, Colonel Bailey built a massive federal case from the inside out. He drank with bootleggers. He rode in the dark with rum runners. He listened to every whisper and took meticulous notes. He let the small, desperate distillers run. He wasn't after them. Bailey was hunting the head of the snake, the criminal network, the crooked deputies, the corrupt merchants, and the Commonwealth's attorney himself. In October of 1934, a federal grand jury was convened in Harrisonburg, a safe, uncorrupted distance away from Franklin County. 3 months later, in February of 1935, they handed down a devastating 22-page indictment. It detailed 68 overt acts of conspiracy. It named 35 individual defendants, plus 1 corporation, and it listed 55 more individuals as unindicted co-conspirators. Among the accused stood a former sheriff and active deputies including Henry Absher, the man from the bridge. There was a state prohibition officer, and sitting squarely at the top of the indictment, Commonwealth's attorney Charles Carter Lee. But before the trial could even begin, the syndicate started cleaning up its loose ends. Deputy Jeff Richards, the bagman who had moved the conspiracy's dirty money, was slated to be the government's star prize witness. He was scheduled to testify before the grand jury in Harrisonburg. He never made it. 17 days before his crucial court date, Jeff Richards was gunned down in cold blood. To this day, no one knows for absolute sure who pulled the trigger. Some whisper it was a fellow conspirator, violently silencing a man who knew entirely too much. Others claim it was a wronged moonshiner, finally settling a bloody score. All that is historically documented is that the government's most valuable insider was dead, and the sprawling federal case would have to go on without him. The Great Moonshine Conspiracy trial opened in Roanoke on April 22, 1935. It quickly became the longest criminal trial in Virginia's history up to that point. 10 grueling weeks, 49 days of gripping testimony, over 200 witnesses took the stand, 176 for the prosecution, 69 for the defense. Sterling Hutchie's son led the blistering case for the government, while Judge John Paul coldly presided over the courtroom. The parade of witnesses that marched through the doors included some of the most colorful and dangerous figures in American criminal history. The undisputed star of the courtroom was Willie Carter Sharp, the notorious queen of the Roanoke rum runners. A woman in her early 30s, with a relentless passion for fast cars and a diamond set glittering in her teeth. Willie had married into the mountain moonshine business. She learned to drive better and faster than any man in Franklin County, leading heavily armed convoys of up to 10 cars at a time on midnight runs out of the hollows. By her own conservative estimate, she had moved 145,000 gallons of illegal whiskey. Other estimates pushed that number to 220,000 gallons and beyond. Between 1921 and 1931, she was arrested 13 separate times for speeding and reckless driving. Finally, in May of 1931, Willie caught a federal charge. She was sentenced to Alderson Federal Prison in West Virginia for 3 years. Fresh out of Alderson when the conspiracy trial began, Willie was the prosecution's shining centerpiece. She took the stand and flawlessly detailed every midnight run, every dirty payoff, and every backroom deal to a spellbound jury. Novelist Sherwood Anderson sat in the audience, frantically taking notes. A year later, he would base his novel Kit Brandon entirely on her life. And then, the Bondurants were called. They were brought in as government witnesses. Forrest and Jack both took the stand and gave chilling testimony about exactly what had happened to them in the cold winter brush. They named the deputies. They described precisely how the violent protection system operated, from the receiving end of a bullet. They weren't on trial as defendants. They were legally recognized as victims of the conspiracy. And when Forrest Bondurant spoke, his words carried the heavy, undeniable weight of a man who had been nearly killed twice and was still fiercely standing. After 3 days of tense deliberation, the verdict finally came down on July 1, 1935. 23 defendants went to trial, 20 were convicted. The guilty included numerous moonshine operators, wealthy merchants, a former sheriff, and the corrupt deputies. But the justice handed out was a bitter pill. The total fines amounted to just $54,500. The combined prison sentences equaled a mere 18 years, spread out thinly across all 20 convicted men. They were insultingly light sentences. Many of the men were right back in the illegal liquor business, before they had even finished serving their time. And Carter Lee, the Commonwealth's attorney, the educated aristocrat, the federal prosecutors explicitly called the instigator of the entire massive criminal syndicate, he walked out of the courtroom acquitted, right alongside 2 of his deputy sheriffs. According to newspaper accounts at the time, one stubborn juror flatly refused to convict anyone unless Lee was allowed to go free. That juror firmly believed that because he was a Lee, a true Virginia gentleman, he couldn't possibly have dirtied his hands in such a conspiracy. But the story didn't end cleanly. 11 years later, in 1946, a brand new federal grand jury convened. They indicted 24 people for tampering with the jury in that original 1935 trial. 22 of them were convicted. Whatever that first jury had decided, it became glaringly obvious they hadn't decided it alone. And then came the strangest historical twist of all. Sometime in the 1950s, the official trial transcript and the court files for the largest Prohibition conspiracy case in American history simply vanished. Gone without a trace. In the 1990s, a retired Rocky Mount lawyer named T. Key Stur Greer spent years exhaustively trying to track them down. He eventually wrote the definitive book on the case. Yet despite his efforts, the official records of the wettest county in the world have never resurfaced. So, what became of the indestructible Bondurants? Howard, the eldest and the most haunted, slowly drank himself into the grave. He never left Franklin County. He worked, he fought, and he carried the heavy, suffocating weight of the war with him every single day, until it finally carried him out of this world. Forrest, the man they couldn't kill, lived for another 30 years. He kept the Blackwater filling station running long after the curtain fell on Prohibition in 1933. He raised his family and lived quietly until December 4, 1965, passing away at the age of 64. By the time he died, the jagged scar across his throat had become a piece of local geography, something men pointed to from across a crowded room in hushed reverence. But Forrest never wrote a memoir. He never gave a single interview. He took every dark secret he knew about Maggodee Creek, Carter Lee, and the corrupt deputies down into the dirt with him. And then there was Jack, Andrew Jackson Bondurant, the vain dreamer, the baby of the family. He lived the longest of them all. Jack married, raised cattle, and grew into a quiet, respected patriarch. In the very same county where he had once bled out on a freezing bridge for refusing to surrender a load of liquor, he lived a full life, dying on November 6th, the year 2000, at 90 years old. Late in his life, when his own family unearthed the yellowed newspaper articles and confronted him about the shooting, Jack offered no grand stories. He simply lifted his shirt, revealed the faded bullet hole under his arm, and said absolutely nothing. It was Jack's grandson, Matt Bondurant, who took those physical scars and that deafening silence and wove them into the 2008 novel, The Wettest County in the World. 4 years later, in 2012, Hollywood transformed that blood-soaked history into the cinematic feature Lawless. Tom Hardy stepped into the shoes of Forrest, Jason Clarke played Howard, and Shia LaBeouf portrayed Jack. The silver screen compressed the truth, invented fresh violence, softened the harsher edges, and it gifted the Bondurant boys a kind of glittering immortality that their grandfather Jack would have likely laughed at and secretly enjoyed. Here's what Lawless gets right. The brothers were real. The ambush at Maggodee Creek was real. Forrest's throat was slashed to the bone, and he survived it. The Great Moonshine Conspiracy was terrifyingly real, and its tentacles reached far deeper than the movie ever dared to show. Carter Lee was a flesh-and-blood aristocrat, and he really did walk out of a federal courtroom a free man, while the deputies beneath him took the brutal fall. But here is what the Hollywood lens distorts. The Bondurants were never pure, righteous outlaw heroes, valiantly fighting a corrupt system. They were active, willing participants in it. They paid the granny fee. They moved their liquor through the exact same criminal network that the crooked law protected. And when they finally pushed back, it wasn't born of some sudden moral purity. It was because the system tried to break them, and they decided that breaking the system back was the only language Franklin County understood. That is the true story of the Bondurant boys. They weren't the invincible, glossy heroes of a Hollywood script. They were three brothers, trapped in a poor county during a desperate time, turning ears of corn into hard cash. They were men who survived federal bullets, the edge of a blade, and the crushing weight of a grand jury. Men who walked out of the wettest county in the world with their lives, their reputations, and the kind of impenetrable silence that true outlaws always keep. The Great Moonshine Conspiracy may have fallen apart in a Roanoke courtroom in 1935, but Franklin County never stopped making liquor. It still does today. The tradition didn't die. It just retreated further back into the dark hollows. The federal raids kept coming, for decades after Carter Lee walked free. And that is the real lesson of the Bondurant story. The Mafia in New York built vast empires on the pillars of intimidation and silence. The Moonshine Kingdom in Franklin County built one on the exact same foundation. It was simply dressed in dirt-stained overalls instead of tailored suits. The faces change, but the structures of power and corruption never do. Wherever the money is big enough and the law is cheap enough, there will always be three brothers somewhere, willing to bleed on a bridge to keep their share of it. Forrest, Howard, and Jack Bondurant didn't set out to become legends. They simply set out to survive. The legend is what Franklin County built around them, because Franklin County desperately needed it. In a place where the law stole your liquor and sold it out the back door, where the Commonwealth's attorney ran the racket, and where deputies could shoot you on a bridge in December and walk away clean, there was only one way left to keep your dignity. You had to refuse to die. The Bondurants refused, that's all. And that, in the bitter end, is what made them indestructible. If this story pulled you into the dark hollows of history, hit subscribe. We drop a brand new, investigative true crime documentary every single week, and drop a comment below. What do you think Lawless got most wrong about the real Bondurant brothers? Was Forrest truly indestructible, or was Franklin County just desperate for a hero? Let us know.